Think canned biscuit dough is just for biscuits? Think again. You might think canned biscuit dough only had one job, but families in the 60s and 70s knew better. When money was tight and cupboards were running low, that little cardboard tube became the foundation for all kinds of meals, breakfasts, suppers, desserts, and everything in between. Today we are looking back at 25 old biscuit tricks that helped stretch leftovers, fill hungry mouths, and keep supper on the table when times were lean. These are the simple, clever recipes that proved a cheap can of dough could do far more than anyone expected. The stretch-a-meal biscuit dumplings. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, when a pound of chicken suddenly shot up from 49 cents to 69 cents, families stretched every scrap by dropping canned biscuit dough into simmering pots. These weren't dainty dumplings rolled with care. These were torn biscuit pieces tossed into boiling broth to triple the size of supper. Canned biscuits puffed up fast, soaking up the broth from Sunday's leftover fryer, or the lip-smacking gravy made from a roux of bacon drippings. A&P even ran ads calling biscuit dough the homemaker's secret helper, hinting that it turned a skimpy meal into something that filled a table. Kids thought these dumplings were handmade because the biscuit layers separated like they were folded by a seasoned cook. Grandmothers rarely corrected them. They simply tore up another tube and pretended they'd planned it all along. These dumplings showed up in chicken stew, turkey carcass broth after Christmas, and even in simple pots of bouillon cubes when money was really tight. The trick was to let them simmer with a lid on. It was not because of technique, but because steam kept hungry kids out of the pot. These dumplings weren't a luxury. They were how families got one more bowl to go around. Biscuit cinnamon roll spirals. This trick spread through church kitchens like gossip. Take a can of biscuits, flatten each one with the bottom of a Crisco can, smear with butter, sprinkle on cinnamon and sugar, roll them up, and slice into spirals. They baked in 8 minutes and tasted like they had come straight from a mall bakery, long before malls even had bakeries. The 1972 Pillsbury Bake-Off even featured variations of this idea, proving that shortcuts were part of the era's innovation. Families often made these on school mornings because they felt indulgent but cost less than buying donuts. Some cooks added a splash of pet milk to powdered sugar to make a glossy glaze, drizzling it over the rolls while they were still warm enough to melt the icing into the cracks. Kids thought this was a holiday treat, but grown-ups knew it was just biscuit dough doing another day's work. These spirals showed up at vacation Bible school breakfasts, neighborhood sleepovers, and late-night card games when people wanted something sweet but fast. They looked impressive in a glass Pyrex pie dish, which made guests believe the host had been up since dawn. Really, it took 10 minutes and one rolling gesture. Poor man's hand pies. Canned biscuits gave birth to the humble hand pie revival after the war, and by the early 1970s, every neighborhood had its preferred filling. Cooks pressed 2 biscuits together with their fingers, spooned in whatever needed using, leftover apples stewed with sugar, mashed sweet potatoes with a dab of butter, or even last night's hamburger crumbles mixed with ketchup. Sealed with the tines of a fork, these little pockets fried golden in shallow Crisco, or baked on a sheet lined with Kroger ads torn from the newspaper. Many families kept a jar of homemade apple butter ready so they could throw together a dozen hand pies before a road trip. Kids loved the sweet versions, but adults quietly favored the savory ones because they used up bits no one wanted to waste. These pies appeared at football tailgates, lunch boxes, and roadside picnic tables off Route 23. Some grandmothers cut slits on top, not for artistry, but to keep the pies from bursting open like they occasionally did in overstuffed batches. They were practical, resourceful, and portable, the perfect example of doing a lot with very little. Before frozen pizza was cheap and everywhere, families made skillet pizza with canned biscuits pressed into a cast-iron pan. Each biscuit was flattened by hand and overlapped to create a makeshift crust that puffed slightly around the edges. Sauce came from a jar of Hunt's, or, during lean months, from a can of tomato soup cooked down with Italian seasoning. Cheese was whatever survived payday, a handful of cheddar, a sprinkle of Kraft processed shreds, or even sliced American singles torn into strips. This pizza baked fast under high heat, filling the house with the kind of aroma that tricked kids into thinking something extravagant was happening. The toppings were usually leftovers, green peppers from last night's stew, browned sausage crumbs, or random vegetables that softened too much in the crisper. Pizza night felt special, even though it cost next to nothing. Families often sliced it into wedges with a butter knife because the crust was not sturdy enough for a pizza cutter, and that added to the charm. It fed everyone without requiring a trip to the store, which was the real victory. Biscuit donuts rolled in sugar. This was the Saturday morning miracle. A can of biscuits, a bottle cap to punch out the centers, and a pan of hot oil. In the 70s, nearly every household had a dented Folgers can of saved grease on the stove, and many used it to fry these donuts. The dough puffed instantly, turning into golden rings that kids grabbed faster than they could cool. Rolled in cinnamon sugar or powdered sugar, they rivaled anything from the local bakery for a fraction of the price. Some families dipped them in a glaze made of confectioner's sugar and a small splash of orange juice, an accidental discovery when frozen concentrate was the only citrus in the house. The donut holes were the prized pieces, quick to cook and even quicker to disappear. Magazines like Family Circle and Woman's Day ran step-by-step features on this in the early 70s. The smell drifted through open kitchen windows on warm mornings, and neighbors sometimes wandered over, pretending to borrow something just to sneak a bite. It was not just breakfast, it was a memory maker disguised as a shortcut. Biscuit chicken pot pie with a lid made from halved biscuits. In the 1960s and the 1970s, when store-bought pie crusts were not as cheap or reliable as they are today, many home cooks simply topped their pot pies with canned biscuit halves. They would simmer leftover chicken, frozen peas, carrots, and a can of Campbell's cream soup until everything blended into a thick gravy. Instead of fussing with rolling pins, the biscuits were sliced in half horizontally and laid over the bubbling filling like a patchwork quilt. The tops browned beautifully, while the bottoms soaked up the gravy in a way pie crust never could. This trick became especially popular during weeks when the grocery budget had already been swallowed by bills or Christmas shopping. A&P ran sales when canned biscuits were 29 cents a tube, and families stocked up because they knew pot pie was a guaranteed crowd pleaser. Many cooks sprinkled paprika on top because it made the dish look fancy without costing a thing. Kids poked their forks through the fluffy tops, watching steam escape like the pie was alive. A tiny moment of entertainment before homework. This was not just supper. It was a way to stretch leftovers into something that tasted comforting, even when money was tight. Breakfast biscuit cups filled with eggs and cheese. Before muffin tins were used for everything from cupcakes to meatloaf, home cooks in the 70s pressed biscuit dough into each cup to form edible shells. Into these little wells went scrambled eggs, diced ham, or even leftover sausage patties chopped into pieces. The dough baked into crisp little bowls that held the filling without spilling it across the pan, a lifesaver on rushed weekday mornings. Kraft ran ads in 1971 suggesting creative ways to use processed cheese, and many took it as an invitation to melt a cube of Velveeta inside each biscuit cup. These cups made kids feel like they were eating something special, even though the entire meal cost less than $1. They also traveled well, tucked into metal lunchboxes between a thermos of milk and a folded paper napkin. Some families saved these for Saturday mornings, while others made a dozen at once and reheated them throughout the week. The brilliance of this trick was that it turned a single tube of biscuits into a batch of individually portioned breakfasts. It was practical, filling, and as close to grab-and-go convenience as the era offered. Poor man's garlic bread made with biscuit rounds. When Italian night rolled around but a proper loaf of French bread was not in the budget, biscuit dough became the stand-in. Each biscuit was flattened slightly and slathered with butter mixed with garlic, salt, and a pinch of dried parsley. They baked fast and puffed into tender discs that smelled like something far more expensive than they were. Many families paired them with spaghetti made from Hunt's tomato sauce, or the infamous boxed Italian spaghetti dinner kit that came with its own can of cheese. Kids did not question the substitution. They just grabbed 2 or 3 biscuits and dipped them into their sauce until the plates looked wiped clean. These garlic biscuits also showed up alongside hamburger casseroles and those skillet meals that relied heavily on onions and canned tomatoes. Some cooks brushed them with the leftover butter mixture right when they came out of the oven to give them a glossy finish, particularly when company was coming. They were simple, cheap, and always dependable, proving that you did not need artisan bread to make a meal taste complete. Biscuit, empanadas made with taco night leftovers. Back in the early 1970s, taco kits were just starting to show up on shelves outside the Southwest, and many families treated them like a fun experiment rather than a weekly routine. Canned biscuits gave families an easy way to reinvent taco leftovers before the idea of meal prepping even existed. Cooks rolled each biscuit into a thin circle, added a spoonful of seasoned meat, a sprinkle of cheese, and sometimes a bit of drained Rotel tomatoes. Folded over and sealed with a fork, they baked into puffy little pockets that hinted at empanadas without requiring the real technique. These showed up in many school lunchboxes during the 70s, wrapped in wax paper and tucked beside a handful of Fritos. They also made frequent appearances after Friday night card games, when leftover taco fixings refused to disappear. The magic of this trick was how it made a small amount of meat stretch across an entire meal. Even picky eaters accepted these pockets without complaint because the biscuit dough softened the spices and made the filling taste familiar. On tight grocery weeks, some families used mashed beans instead of meat, and no one seemed to notice. These biscuit empanadas were quick, portable, and surprisingly comforting, the kind of frugal invention that became a family staple. Biscuit monkey bread made with a tube and a bag of sugar. Before monkey bread became a potluck star, many families were already making a thrifty version using canned biscuits. Each biscuit was quartered and shaken in a brown paper bag with sugar and cinnamon, then dropped into a bundt pan. A simple syrup of melted butter and brown sugar was poured over the top, soaking into every crevice. It only needed about 25 minutes in the oven, but the anticipation made it feel longer. When unmolded, it pulled apart in soft, sticky pieces that kids fought over like treasure. Many families reserved this for Sunday mornings or holiday breakfasts because it felt indulgent without costing much. Pillsbury even ran ads in the late 1960s, encouraging home cooks to experiment with fun, shareable breads, and this became a runaway favorite. Some added chopped nuts when budgets allowed, but most kept it simple. The joy was in the ritual, everyone reaching in, tearing off a warm piece, and licking syrup from their fingers. It was not glamorous, but it tasted like happiness masquerading as thrift. Biscuit-topped skillet cobbler with canned fruit. When fresh fruit got pricey in the winter months, many families turned to canned peaches or cherries to make a quick skillet cobbler. The filling went straight into a cast-iron pan with a little sugar, a spoonful of cornstarch, and a splash of the syrup that clung stubbornly inside the can. Instead of making a proper dough topping, cooks tore canned biscuits in half and nestled them on top, letting the edges touch so they'd rise into a quilted golden cap. As the biscuits baked, they soaked up the hot fruit syrup, turning soft underneath, while staying firm enough to hold a scoop of pet milk whipped topping. This cobbler showed up on weeknights when dessert wasn't planned, but something sweet was expected, especially after long days when families wanted a reward without spending extra money. Many kept Del Monte fruit cocktail in the pantry just for this purpose, even though the grapes tended to dissolve. The trick worked with almost any canned fruit, and because it baked quickly, it fit into the rush between homework, television time, and getting ready for bed. It didn't pretend to be fancy. It was simply a way to make canned biscuits do double duty and turn pantry staples into something that felt like good fortune. Biscuit fry bread for stretching chili or stew. Before grocery stores carried soft tortillas in every brand and flavor, many families used canned biscuits as a stand-in for fry bread. Each biscuit was pulled gently into a thin disc, lowered into a small skillet of hot oil, and browned until it puffed just enough to hold together. These rounds paired perfectly with chili made from kidney beans and whatever hamburger could be spared, giving each bowl more substance without adding more meat. Some cooks sprinkled a little salt on top, while others brushed them with butter to keep them soft for dipping. This trick became especially popular during high inflation periods in the 70s, when ground beef jumped unpredictably and stretching stew became a necessity. Kids loved tearing the biscuit bread into pieces and soaking up the leftover broth like it was a special dish made just for them. The rounds also reheated well on the stove, which made them ideal for workers who packed thermoses and needed something sturdy to go alongside. They were not authentic fry bread, but they filled the same role: quick, warm, affordable, and endlessly useful. Muffin tins saw constant use in the 70s, and one of the cleverest tricks was turning canned biscuits into mini pot pies. Each biscuit was stretched and pressed into a muffin cup, forming a little bowl just strong enough to hold a scoop of leftover stew, diced chicken in gravy, or vegetables mixed with cream soup. As the pies baked, the biscuit edges rose into golden rims that looked like miniature versions of elaborate bakery pies. These were perfect freezer clean-out meals, allowing cooks to use up small amounts of meat or vegetables that would not fill a full dish. They also packed beautifully in lunch boxes, nestled between a wax paper-wrapped cookie and a thermos of soup. Some families topped them with a small circle of biscuit dough as a lid, while others left them open so the filling bubbled slightly over the edge. Pillsbury recipe inserts from the era often suggested these for after-school snacks, and many families took that advice to heart. They were practical, charming, and surprisingly filling. A little nod to creativity during years when stretching one meal into two mattered. Biscuit hot dog roll-ups. Long before pigs in a blanket became a staple, many households wrapped hot dogs in flattened biscuit dough for quick, economical suppers. The biscuit dough clung tightly around the hot dog as it baked, creating a soft, warm exterior that made even inexpensive franks feel substantial. Some families added a thin smear of mustard or a strip of processed cheese inside before rolling them up, inspired by the convenience food craze that swept into American kitchens after the space race. These roll-ups often appeared on nights when the heat was too much for elaborate cooking. They baked fast, and they kept the kitchen cooler than boiling a pot of water. Wrapped in foil, they traveled well to backyard picnics or drive-in theaters, where they were eaten off paper plates balanced on knees. Kids liked dipping them in ketchup, adults sometimes added relish, and everyone agreed they were easier than fiddling with buns. In frugal households, this trick turned two cheap ingredients into a memorable family ritual that cost almost nothing. Biscuit cheese pull-apart bread from the glory days of Velveeta. As processed cheese took over 70s advertising, home cooks found countless ways to sneak it into meals. One beloved version used canned biscuits to make a pull-apart loaf. Each biscuit was cut into quarters and tossed with melted butter mixed with paprika, garlic powder, or whatever seasonings they had on hand. Cubes of Velveeta were tucked between the dough pieces, guaranteeing gooey pockets once everything melted together. The mixture was layered into a bundt pan or a loaf pan, and as it baked, the biscuits rose around the cheese, creating a stretchy, savory bread that disappeared almost as quickly as it hit the table. This recipe often appeared alongside spaghetti dinners or hamburger casseroles, giving families the feeling of a special side dish without spending beyond the weekly budget. Some households added chopped green onions when they were in season. Others kept it simple to save pennies. What mattered was how everyone reached in at once, tugging apart warm pieces and letting the cheese stretch into long ribbons. It was part thrift, part comfort, and entirely rooted in the creativity that defined everyday cooking during those decades. Biscuit sausage pinwheels from church cookbook culture. In the 60s and 70s, church cookbooks were treasure troves of thrifty shortcuts, and one recipe that popped up again and again was the sausage pinwheels made from canned biscuits. The trick was simple. Roll each biscuit into a flat circle, spread a thin layer of breakfast sausage over the surface, and roll it up like a jelly roll. Slice the roll into spirals and bake until the sausage fat bubbles into the dough. The pinwheels tasted richer than their humble ingredients suggested. They were especially popular for early morning gatherings, where cooks needed to bring something warm without getting up before dawn. Some families mixed a pinch of sage or dried mustard into the sausage to mimic the flavor of pricier brands. The pinwheels traveled well in foil-lined cake pans, making them a common sight at PTA meetings and potluck breakfasts. Because each tube of biscuits produced a surprising number of spirals, this recipe became a quiet budget saver for families trying to stretch every pound of meat. People loved how the layers of biscuit dough captured the sausage flavor in every bite, turning a small amount of filling into something that felt generous. Biscuit apple skillet rings fried in butter and sugar. This trick spread through kitchens that kept a permanent stash of bruised apples in the crisper drawer. Cooks sliced the apples into rings, dredged them lightly in sugar and cinnamon, and sautéed them in a skillet until they softened. Then came the magic. A canned biscuit, split in half, was pressed around each apple ring like a halo. The apple-filled biscuits were then pan-fried in a little butter, browning quickly and absorbing the caramelized juices that pooled in the skillet. These rings showed up as Sunday breakfast treats or afternoon snacks when kids returned from school, itching for something sweet. Because the apples bulked up the biscuits, a single can stretched much farther than usual. Many households served them dusted with confectioner's sugar or drizzled with syrup when they had it. They tasted like something out of a roadside diner, even though they cost almost nothing to make. This was resourcefulness disguised as comfort food. It was a way to use aging fruit and a cheap tube of biscuits to create something that felt unexpectedly special. Biscuit crust meat pies for using up the roast ends. In homes where every scrap counted, leftover pot roast was rarely wasted. Cooks shredded the remaining meat, mixed it with onions, potatoes, and a splash of broth, and spooned the mixture into biscuit dough pressed into individual pie shapes. Some folded the dough over like turnovers. Others lined small pans and added dough tops like tiny double-crust pies. As they baked, the biscuits expanded around the filling, soaking up the savory juices and turning tender instead of flaky. These little pies appeared in lunchboxes, on dinner plates, and occasionally in thermos carriers on road trips. They held together well, made use of ingredients that otherwise would have been too little for a full meal, and satisfied even the heartiest appetites. Some families added peas or carrots from the previous night's supper, making the pies even more economical. They were portable, filling, and quietly ingenious, the kind of dish that sprang from necessity and stuck around because it worked so well. Biscuit pie crust for quiche, before quiche was popular. Before quiche became a fashionable brunch dish in the late 70s, many families made their own versions without realizing they were on trend. They pressed biscuit dough into a pie plate, stretching each piece so the edges overlapped slightly. Into this crust went beaten eggs, a splash of evaporated milk, and whatever bits of cheese or vegetables lingered in the fridge. When budgets were tight, chopped bologna or cooked onions often stood in for pricier fillings. The biscuit crust puffed around the edges, giving the dish a rustic look that made it appear more elaborate than it was. This was a popular strategy during weeks when eggs were plentiful but meat was scarce, offering a protein-rich meal that did not feel like a compromise. Some families served it hot from the oven, while others preferred it cooled and sliced like a lunch pie. It was a practical way to turn humble ingredients into something that looked thoughtful and tasted satisfying. Long before quiche Lorraine hit American magazines, these biscuit-based versions were holding households together with creativity and thrift. Biscuit sticky ham rolls for stretching holiday leftovers. Holiday ham always left behind a few scraps, the end pieces, the slices too thin or misshapen to serve, and the little clusters cooked tight to the bone. Families minced these bits into small pieces and mixed them with brown sugar, mustard, and a splash of pineapple juice if a can happened to be open. This sweet, savory mixture was spooned onto flattened biscuit dough, rolled up like crescents, and tucked seam-side down into a greased pan. As they baked, the sugar caramelized, turning the ham mixture into a glossy filling that seeped into the biscuit layers. These rolls often appeared in the days following Christmas or Easter, when budgets dipped and creativity had to fill the gaps. Kids grabbed them as snacks, adults paired them with coffee, and everyone appreciated how the rolls made use of leftovers that otherwise had little purpose. They were frugal and flavorful, and surprisingly festive, a small celebration of stretching what remained into something worth gathering around. Biscuit country dumpling. Bake for leftover broth nights. Some nights in the 70s, the only thing left from a whole chicken was the broth, golden, flavorful, and too valuable to waste. Instead of boiling dumplings on the stovetop, many cooks poured the broth into a casserole dish, added a handful of frozen vegetables, and topped it with halved biscuits arranged like stepping stones. As it baked, the biscuits pulled moisture from the broth, becoming tender underneath and forming a light crust on top. This technique turned a near-empty pot into a full supper without stretching budgets or requiring extra ingredients. A teaspoon of poultry seasoning or a pat of butter on each biscuit made it taste homemade enough that no one guessed how quickly it was assembled. Church cookbooks often labeled this recipe dumpling bake or upside-down chicken stew, though most families just called it dinner. It was the sort of meal that came together in minutes, but still felt thoughtful, especially on cold nights when the house was drafty and everyone wanted something warm that did not cost much. The magic was not in the biscuits themselves, but in how they transformed a simple broth into a hearty, comforting dish. Biscuit pepperoni rolls. Long before pizza rolls arrived in freezer aisles, families made their own version with biscuit dough and a handful of pepperoni slices. Each biscuit was flattened, topped with a few pieces of pepperoni and a pinch of cheese, then folded over and sealed. These little bundles baked fast, filling the kitchen with a kind of savory scent that made kids drop their school books and wander in. They were especially popular in households where budgets did not allow frequent trips to the pizzeria, but children still begged for something pizza-like. Many cooks kept small jars of generic pizza sauce in the pantry, using just a spoonful per roll to give extra flavor without wasting the jar. The rolls fit easily into lunch boxes, reheated nicely on the stove, and cost pennies compared to restaurant versions. They also worked well for sleepovers, where hungry kids devoured them as quickly as they cooled. This was the era's answer to convenient snacks, homemade, humble, and built around whatever was available. Biscuit cinnamon pull-apart breads baked in a coffee tin. Before bundt pans were common in every kitchen, many cooks washed and saved empty coffee cans under the sink and baked pull-apart breads in them. Canned biscuit pieces were dipped in melted butter, rolled in cinnamon sugar, and dropped into the can one by one. As it baked, the aroma drifted through the house, drawing children from whatever they were doing. The tall shape of the can created a soft, tender interior and caramelized edges that tore easily into bite-sized pieces. These breads showed up on chilly mornings when breakfast needed to feel luxurious without costing more than a few cents. Home cooks loved the trick because it reused something already on hand, a habit rooted deeply in the frugality of earlier generations. Even after bundt pans became common, some families stuck to the coffee tin method because it tasted like the past, and they did not want to mess with a good thing. This was not just a recipe, it was part tradition, part resourcefulness, and part memory wrapped in sweetness. Biscuit oven donuts for families without fryers. Not every home had a deep fryer, and some preferred to avoid the splatter and cleanup that came with frying. For them, the solution was oven-baked donuts made by cutting holes into biscuit rounds and brushing them with melted butter. The pieces were rolled in cinnamon sugar or dipped lightly in a coating of sweetened milk before going into the oven. They emerged puffed and golden, lacking the crispness of fried versions but offering a gentler, homey flavor that many families grew to love. These donuts were especially popular on school mornings when time was short, and the oven could handle the work while everyone got ready. Kids loved the donut holes most, popping them into their mouths before they even cooled. Because they required no additional oil and minimal cleanup, they became a go-to treat in households that watched every penny. A single tube of biscuits could produce enough donuts to feed a crowd, making this trick a staple in both frugal and busy kitchens. Biscuit beef stew toppers for cold weather stretching. Winter meals often revolved around hearty stews simmered all afternoon, and biscuit dough provided the perfect finishing touch. When the stew was nearly done, cooks dropped small rounds of biscuit dough on top, letting them bake right in the pot, or they set the stew under the broiler to brown the tops. The biscuits soaked up the beefy juices and vegetables, taking on the flavor of carrots, onions, and potatoes cooked until tender. This trick turned the stew into a full one-pot meal that required no additional sides, ideal for nights when grocery budgets were stretched by heating bills. Some families brushed the biscuit tops with broth mixed with paprika for color, while others left them plain. The result was always satisfying, a stew capped with warm, pillowy biscuits that made the table feel complete. It was practical, filling, and rooted in the belief that a few simple ingredients could comfort an entire family when winter settled in. You know, looking back at all these old biscuit tricks, it's easy to see why they survived generation after generation. They weren't just clever ways to save money, though they certainly did that. They were little acts of problem-solving that kept kitchens humming during years when paychecks didn't stretch as far as families wished. Somehow, a single tube of biscuits could turn leftovers into supper, scraps into snacks, and empty pantries into something that still felt like home. Maybe we don't rely on canned biscuits the way people once did, but the spirit behind these recipes, the creativity, the resilience, the quiet determination to make the most of what's on hand, that's the part worth carrying forward. Because even now, there's real comfort in remembering the dishes that showed up when times were lean, and real joy in bringing a few of them back to the table again. So if any of these old tricks spark a memory or inspire a new one, don't be afraid to try them. After all, a simple biscuit dough has been saving the day for a long time, and it still knows a few good secrets.